we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time watching, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever want to reach out to us, hit us up on Instagram or Twitter. You can donate to our Patreon. I always like to say, share the podcast to your friends if you can. But again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate all you for taking your time to hang out, loyal listeners or new ones. But again, thank you so much for joining. I'm excited about today's episode. I just saw the movie last week now, or a little bit longer, I think now at this point, but still fresh in the mind because it's a story that kind of stuck with me since the first time I heard it. The movie's The Iron Claw. If you haven't seen it yet, it's the 2023 biographical sports thriller, which I thought was an interesting genre choice. But again, it's an A24 picture, so, they kind of tend towards that style. But again, I think a perfect, telling of this story that if you're not familiar with the Von Erich story, you're not familiar with professional wrestling, check out one of my previous podcasts, I should say, about pro wrestling and kind of the world there, but we'll go into some things if you don't know. But if you do know, and hopefully you do, and that's why you're joining us and watching this episode, or you've seen the movie, but either way, you know the story now. But again, there's a little bit more to, this story than just professional wrestling, that's for sure. The Iron Claw was written and directed by Sean Durkin. He's actually a Canadian kid. He did Martha, Mercy, May, Marlene, Elizabeth Olsen's first feature film, and then The Nest, which has Jude Law in it. And I haven't seen those movies, but they're highly lauded. But again, this is I think only his third major motion picture. And again, it's based on the life of Kevin Von Erich and the Von Erich family. Starring Zac Efron as Kevin Von Erich, Jeremy Allen White as Carrie Von Erich, Harris Dickinson as David Von Erich, Stanley Simmons as Mike Von Erich, Holt McElhenney. No, that's I can't even read my own writing. Holt Macaulay, I think, as Fritz Von Erich. Holt Macaulay is such a fucking cowboy name. Maria Tierney as Doris Atkinson, who is Fritz's wife, and Maria Tierney was the mum from Liar Liar, I think. Yeah, Liar Liar. And then Lily James as Pam Atkinson, who is actually Kevin Von Erich's brother. Or sorry, oh my god. It's too many brothers in this fucking movie. Lily James plays Pam Atkinson, who's Kevin Von Erich's wife. It's an interesting casting in certain ways. When I first saw, the first images of the movies, I didn't really look into the IMDb's right away, if they were even listed. But I was kind of surprised that Zac Efron was actually playing Kevin Von Erich. The Von Erichs are a real wrestling family, and we all know what they look like. And it's always tough when you're doing a movie about real people, because, you're very rarely are you going to be able to find an actor who has the chops to act and then also looks exactly like the person that they're portraying. One of the only times I've ever seen it done pretty flawlessly was Bohemian Rhapsody, the guy who played Brian May. That was, who knows, maybe once in a lifetime casting where you barely had to do anything. Because, there's been some good, I'm not saying that there's been no good representations of people in biographies, but, there's been prosthesis or heavy makeup or, all types of shit involved. So, again, it's rare, but, Kevin was kind of a little bit more of a, I don't want to say slender, because he was definitely built, but kind of a long and lanky guy. And Kerry Von Erich was a little bit more stout and kind of tanned, and just like, to me, fits Zac Efron's, like, you know, model, Zac Efron's look a little bit more. And Jeremy Allen White is kind of like a smaller guy. So, you know, that threw me a little bit. It threw me in when I was watching The People versus O.J. Simpson, which is one of those American crime story shows, and they had Cuba Gooding Jr. as O.J. himself. And O.J.'s a big dude. He plays a professional football player. I think he was 6'2" at least, and Cuba Gooding Jr. is not that. And that kind of just threw me, because again, it's like, of all the things, I know we can't get a perfect spinning image, but like, let's at least get the heights right here. Even if you got to stand on a fucking box, like, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to be a tall person, but let's just like make some movie magic happen here. So again, I thought that was really interesting, but Holt McCauley does a great job as Fritz. Stanley Simmons did an excellent job as Mike Von Erich. Now should I say a fifth Von Erich brother? Technically there were 6, but there was a fifth Von Erich brother that's not mentioned at all in the movie. And they say that, and Sean Durkin mentions that he just thought that it's too much tragedy for one movie. Now, if you don't know the story, that's a mega teaser there. And again, maybe this is the spoiler alert that I'll give for this episode. But as we go into the story here, which I'm going to go mostly into the story of the Von Erichs, because that's kind of what I know a little bit more. There's a great documentary series called The Dark Side of the Ring, and they have an excellent episode on the Von Erichs, and it's just a tremendous story, but tremendously sad. And again, a plot that is made for the big screen, clearly. So it all starts with Fritz Von Erich. Fritz Von Erich wrestled in a time in America where wrestling was still definitely considered a sport. The characters were outlandish, but they weren't necessarily over the top. Again, they were kind of still considered as as normal athletes, but still, most professional athletes back in, I'm talking the 50s, were never really paid well. They were just like slugging away. That was like the last thing it was last resort for a lot of the guys, but they weren't getting paid like professional athletes do today. And I don't know what wrestlers have ever really gotten paid. I don't know how well they've gotten paid over the years. But Fritz was kind of struggling to kind of get by as a wrestler himself, trying to get the world title. And yes, if you watch my previous podcast or you know anything about pro wrestling, or if you don't, the outcomes are pre-planned, yes. You can't necessarily say it's fake. They are still flying through the air and smashing each other, but they're making it look like it hurts more than it really does. There's a little something called kayfabe, which is the tacit agreement between pro wrestlers and the fans, that they're going to pretend that everything that they do and see is all genuine. So the whole idea is that you're always upholding kayfabe. You're always doing it. You're always faking it. And it's like, be fake, stay fake. Like there's something about kayfabe that's like this weird, like old circus term. And, again, it's just kind of there to uphold this whole idea that although the match outcome might be predetermined, we're going to still go along with the spills and chills and the storylines, at least. Even though some of the storylines, as you go on in the history of wrestling, continue to get extremely outlandish. But again, that whole idea of kayfabe was still permeated through the sport, and people kind of really believe that. And Fritz Von Erich was actually a heel or a bad guy, in the wrestling industry, you talk about heels, which are bad guys, and you talk about baby faces, which are good guys. And Fritz was definitely a heel, and he portrayed himself as Fritz von Erich, kind of like a Nazi, basically, the evil German, more or less, even though he's from Texas. And people hated him, right? Like that's what he wanted. And he started having children with his wife, Doris Atkinson. They started having kids. Jack Jr. was the first, and he sadly drowned when Kevin was a young boy. But then they ended up having 5 kids after Jack. Kevin, David, Mike, Carrie, and Chris. I don't think in that particular order. I think Carrie is older than Mike. But they had 5 boys, and the boys would go watch the wrestling if they could. They're traveling around in a living in hotels and stuff, and doing all the and moving with the show. And the boys used to tell stories about watching their dad wrestle, and when the crowd was cheering, they knew their dad was losing, so they would all hide and they couldn't watch. But as soon as they heard boos, they'd say, "Oh, Dad's winning again! Like, let's watch." So even they kind of like didn't necessarily know, and as children, they definitely didn't know about kayfabe and how things were being upheld. And Fritz von Erich perfected his signature move, the Iron Claw, where he would kind of grab someone by the temples and squeeze. Who knows how hard exactly, but the opponent would writhe in pain and pretend like they're dying, kind of thing. Again, it's kind of sad where early on they started experiencing these kind of tragedies with Jack Jr.'s loss, and Kevin always says he's the second oldest brother, even though he was the oldest living for most of the time. Again, with Fritz not ever winning the world championship belt, the world title, he actually started promoting like his own wrestling promotion, running his own kind of like wrestling league, so to speak. And, had all the boys wrestling with them. And, the movie portrays Fritz as like kind of like always like playing favorites and picking who's the best and always pushing his sons. But again, I think it's interesting in a lot of professional sports, there tends to be a lot of legacies or like nepotism potentially, but that whole idea of, I don't think nepotism is inherently bad, but again, people and family members grow up around the stuff, they get exposed to that, they see you can do it, and they probably have a genuine natural talent for a lot of these things, right? That does get passed down kind of genetically, so to speak. So all the boys got into wrestling, and even to Mike, and Kevin was a big dude. David was probably the biggest. I think he was about 6'5", 6'6", big boy. And then Carrie was like for sure like the heartthrob, kind of like best looking, in body and face, and then just like was like more of the superstar kind of talent. Even though David was the man as well. And it's kind of funny the movie portrays this a little bit more, but it would have been interesting seeing some of your younger brothers kind of pass you by as Kevin, because Kevin, he wasn't so super smooth on the mic, and I think that kind of hurt him a little bit. But as the wrestling continued, David von Erich had won the American World Title belt, or the Intercontinental Championship or something. Anyway, but he was set to go wrestle in Japan, because you have to win in Japan too to get like the undisputed title or something like that. I don't know how all that works exactly, but and a few days before, David was kind of complaining about like, oh, I kind of have a stomach ache. He's in the movie, he was puking up blood, but he's complaining, and his brothers tried to convince him not to go. Kevin tried to say don't go, but he had a date to go to. He had a time and a commitment, and their dad taught them to hold the commitment. So he went, and all of a sudden they get a call in the middle of the night, and it's a guy from Japan saying, we found David in his room dead. They don't know exactly what happened. You have to come get him, something like that. Anyway, pretty sad. He ended up having diverticulitis, so it's just intestinal rupture essentially, and bled out, and it's a terrible way to die. And Bruiser Brody, who is another famous wrestler at the time, was there in Japan with him and found him in his room. And a lot of people said, "Oh, did Bruiser go in there and hide the pills?" Because you find someone dead in a room in Japan, all of a sudden you think, "Oh, was it drugs? Was it whatever?" But who knows what the boys were doing back in the day, but that wasn't the case. And David unfortunately passed away from that bleed. So with David going down, he was the man. He was the Texas Yellow Rose. And it made a situation for the Von Erichs, because they had these boys here, and you had Kerry and you had Kevin left, and they were top-notch wrestlers. But Mike, he just didn't really have it. He was kind of a little bit skinnier, a little bit smaller. Understood the business, but he's out there wrestling big buff dudes, and they're making him look good, and they're doing the best they can to put him over. But it's hard to convey that sometimes, especially on camera and things like that. And unfortunately, I don't know if they were overseas when this happened, but Mike actually dislocates his shoulder in a match, just pulls when he thought he was going to push, or push when he was going to pull, something like that. Dislocates his shoulder, has an operation on it, and gets an infection in the operation, and then is dead for 3 minutes or something, gets brain damage and stuff like that. Afterwards, they still have him on camera talking he's going to come back, and man, it's a sad sight to see. And you just kind of you feel for the guy, and you kind of hope, you hope for the best, but he's definitely kind of brain injured, and he would go on attacking cars and attacking parking meters and stuff, and just doing wild shit because his brain was fucked up. And he ended up committing suicide. He ended up taking pills and killing himself because he just couldn't handle it anymore, and knew he wasn't going to wrestle again, and just kind of couldn't take it. And like I mentioned before, the guys just kept wrestling, right? All this shit. Even when David died, Kerry had to wrestle for the belt, the next night or something crazy. There's no rest for these guys. Now with Mike down, with David down, they brought Chris. Actually, they brought out Lance first, I think. Lance Von Erich, who wasn't actually a Von Erich. His last name was Vaughn, Vaughn, but not Von Erich. So it would have been kind of funny. Oh, what's your last name, Lance? Vaughn Erich. Who knows, right? But Lance Von Erich was kind of a gimmick, and no one really bought it. They kind of knew he wasn't a true Von Erich, and it just didn't work out. But Chris, again, younger brother, I think too young maybe, not as big as his older brothers, same idea kind of as Mike, and just couldn't live up to it. I don't think I think he either washed out or just couldn't hack it. And he fucking ended up ending his life too. He shot himself as well. It's a fucking sad story. It's a sad story. Don't say I didn't warn you. And while this is all happening, Kerry gets in a motorcycle accident while this is happening. He's driving, he survives a motorcycle accident, but he mangles his foot to the point where it had to get partially amputated. So now Kerry's out there wrestling, and he's getting pushed up, right? Again, with unfortunately all these brothers passing on, Kerry is just getting this big push because he's one of the last remaining Von Erichs, and he's got the charisma to keep going. But now he's out there wrestling with half a foot or a partially amputated leg. And Jeremy Allen White did a pretty good job in the movie of portraying this. Don't get me wrong, but you don't really see too much of him, so it's hard to say. I don't know. It was okay, but again, it was interesting seeing Jeremy Allen White, portray like Kerry struggling with getting back to wrestling capabilities with the leg, and it must have hurt so much. And oh my god. But Kerry kept pushing and pushing, and he started mentioning things to Kevin like, man, it took a lot of courage, for Chris and Mike to end it, And Kevin's going like, man, it doesn't take courage to kill yourself. It takes courage to live. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you know what I mean? Like, don't kill yourself. Like, that's not sick. And one day they're all on the farm. Kerry goes out. He tries to give his dad a new gun. I don't know. Again, this is in the movie, so who knows exactly if it's 100% true, but he tries to give his dad a new gun. His dad won't shoot it or something like that. I don't think that's like the straw that broke the camel's back or anything, but Kerry ends up taking that same gun, walking out to a tree, and shooting himself as well. Kevin went out there just right behind him, just missed him, and saw it happen, unfortunately. Well, the aftermath. And with all this loss, Fritz and Doris are beside themselves. The parents are beside themselves. And at one point, again, this isn't shown in the movie, but Kevin talks about this in the documentary. At one point, Fritz pulls a gun on Kevin, points it right at him, and says, "You'd kill yourself too if you had the balls." And Kevin goes like, "Nah, man, like this isn't like I'm not gonna kill myself, right? Like I think that's when he says, it takes courage to live, not courage to die, or whatever." He's left saying that multiple times, unfortunately, to multiple family members, and ends up having to leave so his dad doesn't fucking shoot him. But there's like a curse that the Von Erichs think that they have too. And that definitely doesn't help anything. Anyway, one of Kevin's last matches in professional wrestling in his prime, he wrestled against Ric Flair, which they portrayed in the movie. Really strange, in my opinion. I didn't like the portrayal of Ric Flair. I thought that the actor that played him got the cadence right, but didn't look 100% great, and didn't get all of his moves, and wasn't as flamboyant as I'd like. I know he played like a younger Ric Flair before he got like a little bit more out there, wild, limousine riding, suit wearing, jewelry wearing. But again, it wasn't super great. But one of the closing lines of the movie, is Kevin saying, "I used to have 5 brothers, but now I'm not even a brother." And it's so sad, right? So much loss, and the movie does a great job telling the story. I think it's again such a heartbreaking story, especially if you don't even know the history, let alone just watching it just for what it is, right? Like, it's just a heartbreaking story to the point where they can't even tell the whole thing. It is truly beautiful, though. There is one of the closing scenes. Again, if you haven't seen it, go check it out. But there's a scene where after Kerry kills himself, he's kind of floating down this boat, and there's a couple coins. Or there's a coin on the boat that he's floating down to kind of represent, the 2 coins you got to pay the ferryman to cross the river into the afterlife. And he's like, "I'm going to see my brothers." And David's there, and Mike's there, and then little Jack is there too. And it's really beautiful and surreal, and it's interesting, and it's a nice use of the form of film and the medium, I should say. Kevin to this day is training his sons, or was training his sons, Marshall and Ross Von Erich. They are wrestling in the AEW currently, tag teaming, killing it. But what really left me with all this, Zac Efron did an excellent job. But, I applaud his portrayal of Kevin, and he acted really well. He looked a little bit mangled. I think the HGH and the steroids definitely did a number on his visage. But again, the whole thing kind of leaves me with thinking, like, after all the stuff, after all the things that happened to the Von Erich family, Kevin, still had his sons go into it and, still supports it in some ways. And it's all he knew, right? It's all he had. It's all he knew growing up. And, I think when you think your family's cursed, I think it's really easy to kind of rail against that, right? And, try to ignore it and try to not believe it because a curse is, woo-woo, not real, whatever that means. But again, just the tragedy alone can just be so, can weigh you down so much. And it's an inspiration, and it's a testament to what humans are capable of when they don't let those feelings overtake them, when they don't let those feelings of guilt and remorse run their lives. Because you can't, right? And as much as we think grief and guilt and loss will diminish over time, that's not necessarily true. We think that, grief is like a ball in a jar, and it's a big ball in that jar. And we think that slowly that ball of grief is going to slowly get smaller and smaller. We'll have more room in that jar to kind of add other things in life. But the truth is that ball of grief is always going to be that size. It's about growing your jar and filling your cup around the ball. That counts. How to move on, how to go forward, right? That's what it's about. And I think Kevin Von Erich, wherever you are, if you're ever hearing this, you're a good man. I'm glad you never did anything crazy. I'm glad those guys stopped you in the rifle shop so you didn't get sent to jail or whatever you were going to do there. Again, God bless you. Go Texas, whatever you want to hear. I know you're out there in Hawaii or whatever, but I'm with you. Check out the movie. Honestly, it's really interesting, but check out the documentary too. It's again a dark side of the ring. I believe it's on Crave. Get it however you get it. But again, sorry, it's a bit of a bummer of a story, right? But man, oh man, the Von Erichs, worthy of big screen. In fact, the story is too big for big screen because poor Chris wasn't involved. Anyway, shout out to everyone. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. Check out our Patreon. Check out our Instagram, Twitter. Hit us up. YouTubes. Share. Podcast. Love y'all. Peace.